Hello and welcome back to our podcast, Bitesize History. I'm Maddie and today we are continuing our civil rights series. In a string of 4 episodes, your hosts Sage, Anna, and I will be discussing and learning about civil rights, ranging from the end of the Civil War in 1865 to today in 2020, how we've progressed and where we are now. In this final episode, we will be discussing the continuation of the fight for civil rights today and the global struggle for racial inequality and equity.
We left off in 1970 after Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination. Like we mentioned, his death marked the end of the civil rights movement. However, this did not completely end protesting and activism across the country. Racism was still prevalent and changes still needed to happen. But unfortunately, many of these issues were disregarded or ignored by the American population, besides a few activists.
Racism and prejudice are not a new concept. They've existed for years in many different forms. First in the form of slavery, then as segregation, and now as prejudice, legal injustice, and police brutality. Recently, these issues have been brought to light. We will now be discussing some of the recent events that have sparked awareness of the racial inequality that continues to be prevalent across the country.
First, we will start off with the tragic story of Breonna Taylor. She was a 26-year-old African-American woman who worked as an emergency room technician in Louisville. In the middle of the night on March 13, 2020, the police decided to search her house, and after a brief confrontation, they fired several shots, striking her at least 8 times. According to the Louisville Courier-Journal, the police were investigating 2 men, who they believed were selling drugs from a house that was far from Mrs. Taylor's home. But a judge had also signed a warrant, which allowed the police to search her home because the police believed that one of the 2 men had used her apartment to receive packages. The police had also a no-knock warrant, which allowed them to enter her home without warning or identifying themselves as law enforcement. Miss Taylor's home mother, Tamika Palmer, said that her daughter had big dreams and planned a lifelong career in healthcare after serving as an EMT.
This is indeed tragic, but it is important to note that there is more than one side to a story. When the police raided her home, Breonna's boyfriend shot at them first, as he thought they were intruders. This is what led the police to shoot at Breonna. Personally, I think this is a really tricky situation, because if someone came into my house forcefully and unannounced in the middle of the night, I would be scared and most likely have a defensive reaction. And of course, if someone shoots at you, you would probably have an equally defensive reaction in response.
So this shows how many situations are not simple and black and white. It is difficult to have a simple, standardized response to such complex situations. But Breonna was shot 8 times, and it was not her who fired the first shot, it was her boyfriend. The extreme violence of what happened is what causes most people to be so alarmed about this.
Right. The police should have announced their presence and should have come in the daytime for an investigation, instead of in the middle of the night, which only escalated the issue.
Now we'll tell the story of a man named Ahmaud Arbery, who on February 23, 2020, was shot and killed while taking a jog in his neighborhood in Glenn County, Georgia. Arbery was not a threat. He did not instigate any confrontation with anyone. He was simply exercising near his home. However, the 2 men who killed him claimed that Ahmaud had trespassed on some land during his run. This is allegedly the reasoning for their attack. This, unlike Breonna's story, was not an act of police brutality. The men who killed him were 2 white supremacists.
Now we will move on to the story of George Floyd. On May 25, 2020 in Minneapolis, George Floyd went to a convenience store to buy cigarettes. The clerk called the police on him, thinking that his $20 bill was counterfeit. When the police arrived, George Floyd did not resist and was completely cooperative with the authorities. Even so, he was dragged outside, and a police officer put him on the ground, with one knee on his back and the other knee on his neck. The police officer held him this way for 8 minutes and 48 seconds. 46. As bystanders... Okay, oh God. The police officer held him this way for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, as bystanders watched. A few took videos of the scene, and many people were begging the police officer to get off him, to let him breathe and let him go. George Floyd himself was also begging for a release, saying over and over, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe." 8 minutes and 46 seconds may not seem like a lot of time, but if you sit down with a timer and really think about what happened for that amount of time, it will quickly become clear how long that would feel with someone pressing you down into the concrete with their knee on your neck. It would be a terrifying way to die. The officers responsible have been charged with second-degree murder after protests have taken place all across the country demanding justice.
All of these horrible events that have happened so recently and so close together have stirred up the world and caused so many protests and riots. People have been reawakened, and the issue of civil rights has been reignited. All of this has sparked an ongoing debate over how to protest and how to fight for rights. First, let's talk about the riots and protests going on and people's different approaches.
Some people are arguing that riots and violence should not be a part of the Black Lives Matter movement, and others argue that without violence there will be no progress. Let's share our thoughts on that.
I think that when people are pushed to the point of desperation, like the Black community and the world was after seeing these things, violence can almost be expected as part of the reaction. However, I do think that many of the people who are ruining property of innocent people, who are probably supporting the movement during an already difficult time, isn't what the movement is actually for. Many of the people whose property was destroyed were Black too. I do think that desperation was what brought people to a lot of violence.
I think that it's a difficult situation when you have been raised in a country that was built off the slavery of your ancestors, and they experienced violence, and so have you all your life. I think it's hard to tell someone not to retaliate in the same way when violence is all they know.
One thing that's amazing about this movement is the fact that everyone nowadays has access to video footage that they can either record or view on social media of some kind. Personally, with social media, I've seen a lot of videos that are showing police violence and other violence against Black or colored people. Something important to understand about what you might see is that many cities have curfews. At the time of the curfew, protests need to be finished. Everyone needs to go home. Once the curfew happens and the protesters are still on the streets, that's when the police have been stepping in. They throw tear gas and beat the prisoners with the batons. Protesters with batons. And sometimes tackle people to the ground. These responses are not okay. Some of the videos have seen of this kind of violence have gotten me really emotional. It's difficult to see, but my point is that it is important to know the backstory of everything you see in the news or on social media before you spread it or make comments about it.
What's interesting about it is the different causes of the violence. Some of it comes from police trying to end protests, some of it comes from people rioting and destroying property, and some of the violence is self-defense. And all of these show the different sides of what's going on. So if you can piece everyone's motives together, it will show you a more clear picture of what is actually going on.
One thing that the media has helped with is spreading awareness about what is going on in the world and in the movement. Part of what made George Floyd's murder such a big deal for everyone across the country and across the world is the media. Someone was able to video the entire incident, and that's how awareness of it spread.
So let's talk about the person that videoed his death and being a bystander and what you can do in a situation like that. One of the things that a lot of people are talking about is what they would do if they had been there, if they would have helped, if they had been able to save him. But the reality is he probably could have not been saved. Most people that watched it happen were also Black. The police were armed with guns, and they had power.
I think the first thing to do is get your camera and say, "I will video this," as a warning to the authorities. It is your right to video it. It's just safer to give warnings so no one gets angry. Because even if you don't have the power to step in and help that person directly, you can at least document what's happening and spread awareness about it.
Yes, and I think that's exactly what the girl who witnessed George Floyd's murder did. She didn't really have the power to stop the situation. She was a young Black teenager who I'm sure already felt intimidated by the situation. And clearly the policeman who was kneeling on George Floyd's neck had the ability and intention to cause harm to someone. Also, naturally, you're going to listen to someone who looks dangerous, is armed, and is also the law enforcement. Which is a huge part of the issue, because if you feel unsafe around the law enforcement, who are you going to call for help if you need it?
Yes, and I think the power you have to record something is really underestimated. This happened even with protests from over 50 years ago, which we talked about in previous episodes. When brutality was shown on the media, it educated people on the reality of what was happening, and it sparked a response from them.
The next thing we want to discuss is the purpose of the movement. Along with the Black Lives Matter movement, things called White Lives Matter and All Lives Matter have emerged also. What's problematic about that is that these distract from the cause. When you promote these things, it changes the focus of the issue to something and someone who it isn't about. Black Lives Matter isn't about all the other people, all the other races and ethnicities that live in America. It's about the Black community, which has been racialized and discriminated against.
I think it can be really easy to get distracted and talk about things that, yes, are related to it, but don't help the cause or stay focused. And of course, everyone's lives matter. We know that already. But we are fighting for respect for all lives. White people already have respect based on their skin tone. Black people often do not. So we have to fight with them for equality, equal rights, and equal respect. Not worry about ourselves or be defensive of our own race right now.
Right. And it's not white people against black people. It's not just about America. It's about the human race all over the world. It's about valuing and respecting someone for who they are, not the color of their skin.
It's not much of a conclusion, as we see worldwide support will continue as we fight for civil rights. Even now, protests are taking place across the nation and across the world. For now, what you can do to help is educate yourself. Double check what you hear in the news, or what you see in the news. Donate to the movement if you can. Have difficult conversations with your family, friends, and others in your life. Show your support for people of color and attend protests if you have the opportunity. This movement will likely continue for a long time, and remember, the whole point of this is to promote respect and love for all people, regardless of color or anything else.
Thank you for listening to our podcast, Bitesize History. This has been the final episode.